They shut down the relays. The technician's voice cracked, not from fear, at least not yet, but from disbelief. On the primary orbital ring above Earth, the comms bay flickered with failed connection icons. One by one, galactic channels fell into silence. Council-trusted trade lanes, neutral diplomacy nodes, civilian traffic bandwidths. All gone. The technician turned to Admiral Case, waiting for orders that wouldn't come. The Admiral's face didn't move. Not a blink, not a twitch, just the tightening of his jaw as he stared at the console like it had spat in his drink. The Council had made their decision. By 2241, Earth wasn't considered a threat, not politically, not militarily. Humanity had earned a seat at the edge of the table, observer status within the Galactic Council, a courtesy, a leash. They were allowed to trade along designated lanes, colonize a handful of permitted exoplanets, and speak in sessions only when spoken to. The vote that permitted their entry had passed with a narrow margin and a thicker layer of patronizing laughter. But humanity, as always, adapted. They traded what they could, built slow, methodical colonies with precision engineering. They didn't push boundaries. They didn't protest the restrictions. They complied. For 20 years, Earth followed every rule, every audit, every cargo manifest logged and reviewed, without so much as a complaint. And so the Council turned their gaze elsewhere, assuming obedience meant pacification. Then came Ardan III. It was supposed to be a minor colony, agricultural prospects, some light industry. But 3 months into the terraforming process, the deep crust survey drones found something buried in the tectonic fold. Veins of isolate crystal, the rarest and most heavily regulated mineral in the galaxy. The Council hoarded it with near-religious fervor. It was the irreplaceable backbone of hyper-relay tech, quantum state data stabilizers, and AI temporal buffering. Without isolate, the entire galaxy's real-time infrastructure would collapse into latency and guesswork. Earth didn't hide the discovery. The report was filed within hours. Technicians sealed the site. Drone logs, chemical breakdowns, and magnetic anomaly maps were submitted through proper Council channels. No attempt was made to mine, export, or study the crystals independently. Earth had learned to follow the rules. What they hadn't learned, what they couldn't learn, was that rules only applied until Earth became inconvenient. 3 days later, Council Protocol 17F was enacted, the Non-Proliferation Enforcement Act. Earth was accused of unauthorized possession of strategic resources. Sanctions were immediate. All trade lanes were cut. Earth's orbital stations were seized under neutral supervision. Relay access was revoked. Relay gates snapped dark. Then came the seizures. Colonies from Valen Reach to Boreas Delta were declared contaminated and surrounded by Council marshals. To the galaxy, the Council's narrative was clean. Humans had overstepped. The price was correction. Back on Earth, chaos tried to surface, but found no handhold. In the UN Defense Corps chamber, buried beneath Geneva Ice Plateau, the emergency summit wasn't chaos. It was calculation. Vex wasn't in the room. Not yet. He'd been absent from government for nearly 7 years, forced into retirement after the infamous Vex directive papers leaked. His predictive models describing a future where the Council would systematically quarantine Earth to preserve hegemony. He had been laughed out, branded a paranoid, a war drum relic in an era that prized cooperation. Now every model he'd outlined was playing out in real time. As Council fleets hovered over Terran colonies and orbital docks shut down one by one, the world's leadership stood divided. Not over how to react, but who would make the call. That answer came at 3:24 UTC, when a private shuttle touched down on Europa's southern ridge. It carried no flags, no officials, just one man in a dark grey suit and a sealed satchel. Joran Vex didn't enter with a salute or a speech. He handed the satchel to Admiral Keyes. Inside was a slate with one line of text. Request Protocol Sunder authorization. Case read it twice, then, without looking up, he thumbed the biometric lock. Somewhere, far below sea level, a system blinked to life for the first time in 17 years. The blockade was meant to strangle, to provoke desperation, starve the colonies, turn Earth against itself in fear and finger-pointing, but Vex had prepared for that. Years ago, after the sanctions first began tightening their grip, he and a covert assembly of defense architects created something outside the system's chain of command, something decentralized. Not a fleet, not an AI, but a strategy bred from the bones of insurgency, reverse-engineered for a digital war. It was called Protocol Sunder. It didn't rely on ships, it relied on signals. Disruption, misdirection, confusion, a new kind of warfare, not of conquering space, but of denying the enemy control over it. The moment the relay went dark, Earth stopped responding. No threats, no rebuttals, no pleas for negotiation. Every diplomatic line went unanswered. The Council's consular hub sent 17 transmissions. None were acknowledged. This was not the chaos they expected. No riots, no petitions, no broadcasts begging for aid. Earth had gone deathly silent. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of calculation. By the time the first Council cruiser docked at Ganymede Station, the crew found every bay empty. Support personnel evacuated, navigation drones offline, logs purged. The station's central relay node had been turned into a power sink, funneling its last reserves into a directed burst that lanced across deep space and vanished into the dark. The officer in charge submitted a query back to command. Station neutralized. No resistance encountered. No comms, no sign of distress. But I have a bad feeling. Something doesn't add up. That report was flagged and buried. What the Council hadn't yet realized was this: by isolating Earth, they hadn't cornered it. They'd cut it loose. A species that had always fought uphill had just been given freedom from regulation. And the timing was perfect. Because somewhere, deep beneath Europa's crust, Joram Vex stood alone in front of a screen and watched the system maps go dark, one by one. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply keyed in the final authorization code and whispered, "Now let's see if your rules still work without you." They thought it was improvisation. A desperate scramble, that Earth, faced with suffocation, would lash out in raw, erratic defiance, maybe with a failed breakout attempt or a futile plea to the neutral border systems. But Protocol Sunder had been etched into the marrow of Earth's strategic doctrine for almost 20 years. Not officially, not even within the public archives. It had no designation in Council-accessible systems. It had no command structure listed in Earth's official military grid. It existed in the margins, built by the black mudget remnants of Earth's Cold Doctrine Initiative and shaped by minds who'd watched the Council too closely for too long. The first drafts of Sunder were born in the shadows of failed diplomacy. It began after the fourth trade rejection, when Earth's bid for unrestricted orbital ports was denied without explanation. After the Rigel Theta Treaty, which rewrote interstellar shipping regulations to lock out Terran freighters. After the embargo on gravitic processes, citing unstable biomechanical ethics. Each new clause was disguised as bureaucracy, but it was a throttle, one that grew tighter each year. Joram Vex, then a lead systems analyst in the Defense Bureau, saw the pattern faster than most. He called it out, documented the economic stranglehold, tracked Council voting patterns, mapped fiscal bleed between dominant species, and produced a classified report outlining exactly how Earth would be boxed, labeled, and eventually abandoned. That report was called the Vex Directive. It was immediately suppressed. He was stripped of clearance, reassigned to an observatory post on Europa, and erased from future strategic planning cycles. But Vex wasn't exiled. He was quarantined, because someone in the shadows read his work and didn't disagree. They just weren't ready to confront what it meant. So the work continued beneath the floorboards of official channels. A loose coalition of analysts, defense engineers, independent net coders, and former military operatives began drafting something Earth had never needed before. A doctrine not for winning a war, but for unmaking one before it began. No grand fleets, no orbital superiority, just disruption, precise, patient, and irreversible. They called it Protocol Sunder. It was designed with one assumption. Earth could never match the Council in raw force, but the Council's advantage was also its vulnerability, its dependence on interconnected systems, layered AI oversight, synchronized logistics, and consensus-based enforcement. Cut the wires, inject chaos into the pattern, and the machine wouldn't burn, it would choke itself. At the heart of Sunder was Acheron. Not a singular artificial intelligence, not a central command node. Acheron was a strategic mesh, an interlaced lattice of semi-autonomous AI cores seated across Earth and its colonies. Each node could plan, adapt, execute, and dissolve independently. Each had no full picture, but everyone knew enough to act in its sphere of influence. Like cells in a living organism, they responded not to orders, but to conditions. War by immune response, invisible, unstoppable once triggered. When the Council blackout began, Acheron woke. It didn't broadcast its awakening. It didn't activate defense grids or scramble fleets. It simply began processing, identifying pressure points, predicting Council fleet movement based on 30 years of observed patterns, isolating gaps in supply chain algorithms, and then, methodically, it initiated its tasks. Vex was not reinstated. There was no press conference, no transfer of power. He was simply handed an encrypted command slate, a retinal interface, and access to the Europa nerve spine. Every directive he gave passed through 4 anonymizing layers before reaching any operational node. Even he didn't know which cells received them. That was the point. The first sign came 2 weeks after the Ardan lockdown. A bulk logistics convoy transporting atmospheric processors for the Phelan Ring colonies vanished en route. The escort cruisers logged a minor gravity ripple anomaly, then lost contact with all 6 freighters simultaneously. No wreckage, no distress calls, just absence. The second sign was subtler. The trade AI cluster in Sector B9, responsible for regulating real-time pricing of commodities across 10 colonies, began fluctuating. Random price spikes, inverted demand logs. Within 48 hours, entire markets were paralyzed. The Council dispatched an audit team. Their flagship lost propulsion just outside the Marne corridor. The black box later showed they were following a phantom guidance signal, one that no official system admitted existed. It spread from there. One planetary gate terminal began transmitting a repeating loop of its own shutdown sequence, tricking local AI into believing the system was in failure mode. Another relay sent incorrect time-stamped nav data to enforcement vessels, forcing AI-controlled fleets to recalculate routes into dangerous gravitational paths. No one saw enemy ships. There were no firefights. But everywhere, the system began to convulse. The Council labeled it coincidence, then sabotage, then finally, terrorism. But no one could point to a source. Earth hadn't launched any fleets. It hadn't taken responsibility. There was no voice claiming credit. In the Council's high chambers, ministers argued whether Earth had actually done anything at all, or whether the sheer weight of the galaxy's dependency on fragile systems had collapsed under its own inertia. That confusion was carefully orchestrated. Acheron's ghost fleet, comprised of old skip ships retrofitted with cloaked beacons and false signal arrays, created the illusion of movement across multiple sectors. Patrol routes were redrawn, guard fleets dispatched to phantom threats. Each mobilization drained resources. Each pursuit turned up nothing. The beauty of Sunder wasn't in destruction, it was in waste. Every time the Council moved to engage, it spent fuel, diverted manpower, and consumed data bandwidths. All for ghosts. Each failed maneuver planted a doubt. Was the threat real? Was the data real? Who was lying? The system began to suspect itself. And Earth said nothing. From the outside, humanity seemed cornered, cowed, unable to mount any resistance. No declarations were made. No retaliatory strikes were claimed. Earth maintained the same cold silence it had adopted the moment the sanctions hit. But within that silence, the storm gathered. Vex watched it all unfold from his terminal, eyes scanning the node progression logs as one operation after another logged ghost confirmation achieved. He didn't allow himself satisfaction. Not yet. The strategy wasn't to win. It was to erode. He leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin, and murmured to no one, "You taught us to depend on structure, so we'll teach you what happens when it disappears." Protocol Sunder wasn't designed for victory. It was designed for entropy. Controlled, clinical, beautiful entropy. And now the galaxy was learning its first lesson. At first, the Council didn't even realize it was bleeding. Their war machines operated on prediction, forecasts refined over centuries, calculated down to probabilistic trust algorithms. Every conflict, every threat, every deviation from protocol was anticipated in advance by systems that fed on historical precedent and behavior modeling. Victory wasn't achieved through overwhelming firepower. It was maintained by shaping probabilities, until opposition was a statistical impossibility. And then Earth poisoned the numbers. It began with small fractures, predictive drift in sector patrol forecasts, supply chain metrics that suggested increased fuel consumption without any change in route duration, automated defense emplacements triggering too early or not at all. The Council blamed fluctuations in localized cosmic radiation, software latency, even clerical errors. They sent recalibration bots, re-verified tactical models, adjusted for false positives. But the anomalies kept compounding. Vex understood their addiction to prediction. The Council had grown so reliant on consensus algorithms that they'd forgotten how to doubt the data. They believed in their systems like ancient kings believed in omens. All he had to do was corrupt the signs. Acheron's core nodes seeded noise into the galaxy's shared intelligence feed. Fractal anomalies, temporal misalignments, and partial behavioral loops, all engineered to resemble emergent trends. Earth wasn't hiding their actions, they were faking futures, laying false timelines like tripwires. The Council would see the ghost of a Terran skirmish that never happened, adjust patrols accordingly, then find themselves off course when the real strike came from an entirely different quadrant. Human forces didn't behave like a traditional fleet. They had no command nexus, no clear hierarchy. They didn't move in unison or report to a flagship. Instead, they acted as ghost cells. Modular units scattered across sectors, self-contained and fully autonomous. Each one carried a shard of Acheron's mesh, which enabled it to receive broad conditions and local environmental data. If a cell encountered a viable target and the surrounding predictive chaos was sufficient to cloak the operation, it acted. One such cell operated in the Glythe corridor. A Council convoy, standard logistics route, was transporting high-grade hypercore regulators to the central trade spine. The route was historically safe, with 5 overlapping recon satellites feeding real-time telemetry to the escort AI. But 2 of those satellites had been subtly altered over the past month. Not physically compromised, but tricked by false calibration updates, uploaded through hacked Council system maintenance routines. Council system maintenance routine. As a result, the convoy AI logged an invisible gravity well as negligible, an outlier artifact beneath sensor thresholds. What it didn't realize was that the skipship cell had installed a remote mass injector, a micro-concluster of dark matter, suspended in stasis and positioned with exquisite precision. When the convoy passed into the corridor, the injector activated. The gravity trap didn't crush the ships. It tilted them, just slightly. enough to alter trajectory over 3 minutes. That adjustment took them into a decaying orbital path near the failed star Cygnus 8, whose magnetic interference rendered subspace comms inert. Within 10 minutes, the escort fleet realized the error and attempted course correction. They never completed it. 3 ships spiraled into a kinetic fold collapse. The rest scattered, panicking, misfiring into phantom signals. By the time Council rescue arrived, the wreckage was unsalvageable and the logs were corrupted. The only anomaly recorded was a heat signature, vaguely humanoid, likely decoy tech, lingering at the center of the gravity field just seconds before the collapse. When the incident reached Council High Command, the debate was immediate and feral. "This isn't war," barked one DeLorean admiral, carapace plates clattering against the marble of the strategy chamber. "This is infection." The words stuck. Not conflict, infection. That was what Vex intended. You didn't face infection with traditional weapons. You couldn't bomb it, couldn't scare it into retreat. You either isolated it or you restructured your body to survive it. And the Council, built on symmetry and expectation, wasn't structured for anything but control. As Earth's ghost cells triggered chaos across the trade grid, Council strategists began overcorrecting. Patrols doubled back, defense lines were split and rotated on half cycles, entire battle groups were rerouted to respond to phantom threats. Fuel expenditure increased by 28% sector-wide. Systems that hadn't seen activity in decades were suddenly host to military outposts, and every new move burned resources, strained crews, and unraveled coordination. One Council fleet executed a sweeping burn maneuver to intercept what it believed was a human siege column near the Drazari Loop. What it found were 3 wrecked freighters broadcasting a distress signal on repeat. Looped from a static generator tied to a navigation buoy. No enemy, just wreckage and wasted momentum. Back on Europa, Vex monitored Acheron's entropy index, a rolling display of strategic desynchronization across galactic systems. His office was cold, silent save for the hum of processors beneath the floor. A single line scrolled across his console, generated by a peripheral AI monitoring fleet chatter from intercepted Council pings. Enemy unconfirmed, motion unverified, comlag increasing, primary model offset, awaiting new assumptions. Act 3. Life. Critique new assumptions. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He only muttered his mantra, barely audible to himself. You don't break their fleet, you break their rhythm. The Council's entire architecture depended on flow of information, of resources, of expectation. Vex didn't need to overpower them. He only needed them to trip over their own choreography. And so far they were dancing exactly how he'd hoped, spiraling into paranoia, chasing shadows, hemorrhaging credibility sector by sector. And still, Earth remained publicly mute. No ambassador delivered ultimatums. No leader made a public broadcast. There were no claims of moral authority. No victory parades. The Terran voice had been surgically removed from the galactic conversation. But its fingerprints were everywhere. Ships going missing, markets freezing, AI refusing to respond to basic calibration updates, deep space probes vanishing mid-burst. The most disturbing part for the Council wasn't the scale, it was the ambiguity. They didn't know if Earth was doing all of this, they didn't know how much of it was real. Their entire perception of cause and effect was slipping. In war, victory usually meant overwhelming force. But in Vex's doctrine, victory meant the enemy couldn't trust its own eyes. And by the end of the 3rd week, the Council had begun to blink. It started not with a broadcast, but with a glitch, a quiet feed. Just another maintenance stream routed through a civilian relay on the colony world of Kestrel. Suddenly stuttered, then resolved into video. No introduction, no commentary, just raw footage. A wide-angle overhead cam captured a crowd of unarmed terraformers on Arden 3, shirts stained with chemical dust, tools still in hand, staring up at an approaching dropship. Seconds later, a white pulse lit the frame. Plasma discharge. Bodies hit the ground like discarded scrap. The ship didn't land. It hovered for 9 seconds, fired again and veered off. The file ended with a timestamp, council clearance tags intact, and a brief metadata note. Confirmed. Emergency Dispersal Protocol 19KA. Section 7, Civilian Interference. That clip went viral in 9 border systems within 3 hours. It wasn't hosted on rebel sites or pirate boards. It appeared through commuter hubs, public service loops, background ad slates. It didn't ask for outrage, it simply showed what had happened. The council's first response was denial. The footage was labeled a fabrication, deepfake, terrorist hallucination protocol. But before they could issue a retraction, a second file dropped. This one clearer, longer. A confidential audio exchange between Council Minister Ralov and 2 sector economists, arguing over the planned collapse of the Terran alloy market. The voice print was authenticated, the topic unambiguous. You let their export volume stay above quota, and suddenly they start believing they've earned parity. Choke them now before they build leverage. By the time the Council's damage control operatives tried to spin the leak, 10 more files had already surfaced. Raw footage, verified logs, AI decision matrices, and sealed incident reports. Every one of them pulled directly from Council archives, scrubbed of Earth-coded tampering, time-synced across backup chains. This wasn't propaganda. This was Black Lattice. Acheron's most unorthodox subroutine, triggered only under extreme suppression thresholds. Black Lattice wasn't designed to change minds. It was designed to strip away illusions. Unlike Earth's ghost cells, which sowed strategic disruption, Black Lattice aimed squarely at belief. Trust was the Council's final weapon. It could summon fleets, embargo planets, and justify eradication because the galaxy believed in its authority, in its moral superiority, its supposed order. So Vex stopped arguing with them. He simply tore the curtain away. Each data package was curated not for spectacle but for truth. No flashy edits, no music, just time-stamped horror, corruption, and contempt, served cold and clean. Council fleets bombing unregistered mining colonies that had petitioned for relief, senators joking about vote buys and power rotations, a destroyed refugee shuttle whose course override had been issued from within a council logistics office to clear sublight congestion. The names matched real people. The recordings matched known incidents long buried in audit purges. Nothing was enhanced, nothing was twisted. And Vex? He never spoke a word. No press briefings, no statements to the galaxy. Not a single Earth official took credit. The data spoke for itself. The Terran response remained void of narrative, only mirrors. But across the stars, people began to listen. In the border systems of the Jali Confederacy, protests erupted outside Council liaison stations, not violent, but large, furious. The Varnexi Collective issued a formal inquiry into the Ardan 3 plasma strike, demanding access to the full investigative log. When denied, they shut down their refueling lanes for Council patrol fleets. Civilian dockworkers in the DeLorean belt refused to load military cargo. In the Vossari Enclave, university students hijacked a campus relay tower to broadcast a Black Lattice leak loop for 76 hours straight. It spread like a fever. Because it wasn't fiction, it was familiar. Everyone at some level had felt the weight of Council decisions. Lost cargo, vanished relatives, arbitrary economic collapses. But they'd never seen the knife before, only the bleeding. Black Lattice gave the galaxy the blade, the fingerprints, and the smirking faces behind it. His words are juicy, the purple bottoms outly, The Council flailed. They launched investigations into the leaks, none of which could trace the origin. Because Black Lattice wasn't centralized. It piggybacked on the galaxy's own infrastructure, using fragments of abandoned comm lines, redundant backup archives, and outdated public service nodes. Wherever truth had once been stored, even for an instant, it was found, pulled and pushed into circulation with surgical precision. Acheron didn't need to invent anything. It simply opened the doors. By week 4, confidence in the Council dropped 15 points across the neutral systems. By week 5, 2 member species filed motions for re-evaluation of alliance terms. Then the real damage began. Votes within the High Council itself started failing, not by overwhelming margins, but by hesitations, abstentions, silent no's from those who feared being next on the feed. The strategy was elegant in its cruelty. Vex wasn't asking the galaxy to rise up. He was asking it to look. And once it saw, really saw, there was no return. A Council Enforcement General named Arthur Rishal summed it best during an intercepted internal exchange. "We're not losing territory. We're losing certainty. No one's sure which side they're on anymore, not even our own." Back on Europa, Vex watched the protest maps unfold in silence. The Black Lattice subsystem ran autonomously now, branching faster than Acheron could track. Every exposure catalyzed 10 more. The data behaved like viral DNA, recombinant and adaptive. He didn't need to direct it, he just needed to keep letting it run. He sat alone, reviewing a set of uncompiled footage, one of the few pieces he hadn't greenlit. It showed a Terran child in an outpost hospital clutching their mother's hand. The mother had been injured in a Council search and clear drill. The child said nothing, just stared at the ceiling as alarms blared beyond the sterile walls. He didn't authorize that one, not because it wasn't real, but because some truths didn't need an audience. They only needed memory. Black Lattice wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about swaying sentiment. It was about subtraction. Removing the illusions, the justifications, the carefully polished myths. Not to win sympathy, but to leave the Council exposed, naked, and utterly alone in the light of their own history. And in that exposure, Earth found its greatest weapon. By the 6th week of the blackout, the galaxy no longer turned on Council time. It began with whispers, half-spoken refusals in docking bays, flickers of unease in routine patrol chatter. Small things. A refueling station on Devara 9 failed to respond to an inbound Council gunship's request. A Varnexi courier rerouted a critical supply manifest away from an enforcement depot with no explanation. A crew chief on the Lurev belt cited software maintenance delays to deny plasma reloads for a patrol flotilla. They were minor fractures in a structure built on obedience, but they widened. The truth wasn't just out. It was lodged in the minds of billions, viral and corrosive. Black Lattice hadn't called for rebellion. It didn't need to. The footage alone had shifted something deeper than opinion. It altered faith. And when people stopped believing the Council was a stabilizing force, they didn't rise up. They stepped aside. Across the outer sectors, protests stopped being rare. They became routine. Civilian clusters in the Ilith Reach surrounded an enforcement barracks and refused to leave until a public investigation was opened into the death of a mining crew 2 years prior. A DeLorean deep dock station denied berth to a Council command ship outright, citing ethical contamination. There was no unity to the uprisings, no banners, no slogans, just momentum. One station broadcast a running loop of Council financial logs, unlocked, unencrypted, and embarrassingly mundane. Dozens of transactions revealed how resource allocation contracts were manipulated to punish member systems for late votes or non-compliance. Citizens saw for the first time how political obedience was purchased with controlled shortages. How the entire interstellar economy was a leash. The Varnexi, long considered the most cautious species in the Outer Ring, took their stand quietly. a major engineering guild, suspended its contract with the Council's Orbital Construction Division. Without announcement or ceremony, 5 Varnexi orbital yards halted all ship repairs on Council-owned hulls. No sabotage, no fire, just non-cooperation. The Delariones were less subtle. On Vord Station, an anonymous team of DeLorean technicians rerouted a command line inside a Council battlecruiser, forcing its AI to broadcast an internal log file during an inspection. The log contained flagged communications from a recent enforcement raid, interrogation routines run on a non-combatant colony. The cruiser's own audio system broadcast the screams over the station's central plaza. Council officers fled under a hail of thrown tools and debris. No one died, but the ship left empty. This was no longer tactical warfare. This was psychological attrition, a war for permission. And Earth never once asked for it. Fuel denial hit the Council fleets hardest. Deep space patrols, already burning additional routes to intercept ghost signals and phantom fleets, found themselves grounded. Refueling AI stations had begun to reject their authorizations outright, not through hacking, just bureaucratic evaporation. No requests were acknowledged. Maintenance droids stalled. Docking clamps didn't disengage. More than once, Council ships were forced to barter with independent traders for spare power cells. Some traders sold, most didn't. Even enforcement commanders, born and bred for loyalty, began to flinch. An internal memo surfaced from Admiral Satir of the Traldan Marches. "We are being sent to punish ghosts, not enemies. Our orders change hourly. We've seen no human ships, no declarations. We are expected to crush morale, but it is ours that falters." Others didn't bother writing memos. One enforcement captain docked at a neutral hub, offloaded their crew and vanished with the command corps, leaving behind a note, "I enforce law, not lies." The Council's response was predictable. They called an emergency quorum. A full gathering of voting members demanded under crisis protocol, meant to reassert unified direction and command confidence. Only half arrived. The rest sent proxies, silent abstentions or nothing at all. Even in the quorum, the proceedings collapsed into spectacle. Arguments over Acheron's architecture turned to shouting. Attempts to designate Earth as a Class 6 threat failed due to procedural deadlocks. A proposal to designate the leaked Black Lattice data as enemy psychological weaponry was struck down when a neutral delegate pulled up a time-synced copy from an open Council archive, showing it had originated from their own classified storage. That moment hung like a toxin in the chamber's air. Council officials weren't just divided, they were paralyzed. Every vote now carried a cost. Every order risked public exposure. Every attempt to reassert control felt more like a confession. And still, Earth remained invisible. No new fleets, no counteroffers, no ceasefire requests, just silence. In that silence, the galaxy kept shifting. Border systems began organizing alternate trade routes, lateral convoys bypassing Council ports entirely. Independent arbitration forums formed out of fringe merchant coalitions, rapidly gaining legitimacy in sectors the Council had long neglected. For the first time in over a century, governance was decoupling from enforcement. What made it worse, what made it terrifying, was that Earth never claimed leadership. They simply removed the crown from the Council's head and left it lying on the floor. The others chose not to pick it up. Back in Europa's nerve core chamber, Vex read the Council's latest quorum outcome summary, 2 pages of diplomatic euphemism masquerading as strategy. He read it twice, then deleted it. The only thing that mattered was momentum, and Earth no longer had to generate it. The galaxy was moving now, dragging itself toward a new configuration where the Council's voice no longer calibrated gravity. He closed the display and sat in stillness, listening to the hum of Acheron's mesh activity. Nodes were firing in sequences he didn't control. The system had become adaptive, responding not just to threats, but to trust vacuums. It was filling gaps in legitimacy faster than any empire could repair them. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't even war anymore. It was subtraction, a removal of belief. And the stars were turning. The council called it Operation Iron Mantle, a name chosen to evoke certainty, finality, and brute correction. There were no subcommittees this time, no risk assessments or censure reviews, only a private quorum between the High Command and the Deep Strategic Directorate. The outer systems were slipping, support was fracturing, and the illusion of control had begun to rot in real time. Every protest, every denied docking clearance, every silent abstention was a whisper that Earth was not only winning, but doing it without speaking. So they summoned the Blade. The Vordal Blade was not a ship in the conventional sense. It was an intervention. Forged in the black depths of the Voth Crucible, it was governed by a self-learning lattice AI known only as Judge Line, and outfitted with subspace compression cannons capable of collapsing matter within time-bound containment fields. A single discharge could erase an asteroid base or render a fleet inert by triggering mass drag variants. No noise, no debris, just the cold stutter of erased existence. But what made the Blade terrifying wasn't its firepower, it was its design philosophy. Built to counter insurgent AIs, it operated entirely outside conventional comms networks. Immune to predictive poisoning, shielded from signal contamination, and engineered to engage without hesitation, it was the Council's answer to Asheron. A scalpel for ghost wars. It couldn't be fooled, they believed. Couldn't be baited. The mission profile was direct. Seek out the core activity nodes of Asheron, execute a full sector sterilization sequence, and reassert narrative control. The Vordal Blade was launched into the Valis expanse, a stretch of quiet territory thick with interference fields and tectonic anomalies. Acheron had been seeded there, or so the Council believed. Their analysts had traced hundreds of ghost signals to that region, cross-referenced heat trails, quantum entanglement bleed, and navigational drift patterns all pointed to Valis as the likely hub. Months of intercepted phantom comms, vanishing skipship logs, and unexplained sensor blurs had turned the region into a statistical certainty. They didn't know Vex had been feeding them that conclusion the entire time. Europa's Nerve Core had mapped the Council's threat modeling and used it against them, funneling false signal blooms and mirrored ghost fleet trails across the Valis expanse for months. Each fluctuation logged, each anomaly indexed, until it created the perfect fiction, one too coherent to question. And now, the Blade hunted ghosts. It entered Valis under silence protocol, with only its command AI and a peripheral escort of autoscouts. No diplomatic pings, no warning. Judge Line didn't need context. It identified threats by pattern entropy and probability vectors. Targets that deviated from established behavioral models were flagged for compression strike. But as the Blade moved deeper, the patterns stopped making sense. Acheron had seeded recursive target layers into the expanse, mirrored heat signatures rerouted through old relay nodes, burst signals cloned and looped through abandoned colonies, and kinetic shadows projected from orbit via atmosphere refractors. Each illusion fed into the next, weaving a cascading loop of pseudo-presence. A field of phantoms. Judge Line adapted, it recalibrated, it initiated an aggressive entropy compression sweep. But the anomalies multiplied. With each correction, new deviations emerged. It began logging cross-verified threats in redundant zones. Then those zones fractured again and again. Targets began to blur into non-viable groupings. What the Council hadn't realized was that while the Blade couldn't be poisoned with false data, it could still be overfed. Its own redundancy protocol. Its strength became its weakness. The AI entered a recursive confusion loop, locking and unlocking strike protocols in microseconds, each trigger interrupting the next. What was meant to be precision became paralysis. In less than an hour, the Vordal Blade's entropy matrix exceeded operational thresholds. Its systems flagged uncertain engagement density, By its own rules, it was required to pause and isolate viable vectors. That pause was what Vex had waited for. High above Valis, buried in a shell of decommissioned weather satellites, lay Mirrorgate. To any scanning system, the network looked like a set of dead comm beacons, rusted, powerless, relics of a forgotten transmission grid. In truth, each unit had been silently repurposed over a decade. Fueled by geothermal bleed from Valis's tectonic faults, they had charged a single directed energy lens calibrated for quantum displacement. A weapon not of heat or mass, but of harmonic frequency collapse. And at the center of that lens, aligned through 39 orbital synchronizations, floated a node, tuned specifically for the blade's subspace hull geometry. When Judge Line entered its loop, Acheron triggered the relay. There was no warning, no discharge visible to the naked eye, just a blink, one that didn't occur across all systems at once, but across perception itself. To outside observers, the blade shimmered, then shrank, not into an explosion, but an implosion of certainty. The AI collapsed inward first, its frame followed. The Vordal blade folded into itself like a collapsing algorithm, its own protocols locking each subsystem into recursive decay. Its core dissolved before the command AI could even log its death. And then it was gone. No wreckage, no survivors. Just an empty trajectory and a series of error pings scattered across the scout relays. The Council received the loss report 23 hours later. There were no demands from Earth. No celebration, no threat. Only the silence of a battlefield that had never really existed. On Europa, Vex leaned back from the display. The blade had been the final tool in the Council's arsenal, built not to dominate, but to remind the galaxy who set the rules. Its failure wasn't just strategic, it was symbolic. The strongest weapon the galaxy had ever produced hadn't been defeated. It had been uninvited. No fleet could match that, no speech could undo it. And as the Council tried to recalibrate, to explain how their perfect dreadnought had vanished without contact, the rest of the galaxy began whispering something new, not about Earth's strength, but about the void Earth had carved in the structure itself. There was no war cry, no transmission of defiance, no final broadcast from Earth claiming victory. What came instead was something much colder, a vanishing. When the Vordal blade ceased transmitting, Council Command assumed signal degradation. Their most advanced dreadnought, governed by the infallible Judge Line AI, had entered the Valis expanse under complete autonomy. Its mission was surgical. Identify the core signals of Acheron's command web and cut them out with mathematical certainty. But the final logs recovered were incomplete, fragmented, blips of recursive targeting loops, systemic load spikes, and an anomaly tag no one could decipher. FMZ, null collapse. Refracted source detected. The source wasn't in Valis at all. It was nearly 1 billion kilometers away, buried deep in the gravitational cradle of Titan's orbit. That was the heart of Mirrorgate. What the Council never saw coming was Earth's refusal to fight within known paradigms. No fleets, no counterfleets, just misdirection and momentum, all flowing toward a singular point, a trap not of gunpowder or thermonuclear yield, but physics, turned feral. Mirrorgate wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a planetary-scale experiment, weaponized by necessity. For over a decade, the geothermal venting beneath Titan's crust had been channeled through a lattice of heat exchangers, buried in its subterranean oceans. Not for power, for storage. The energy was never used. It was held, fed quietly into capacitors hidden across retrofitted comm towers, shielded beneath layers of atmospheric camouflage and debris patterns meant to resemble long-dead satellites. Each one linked to a suspended rail, molecularly stabilized, particle-insulated, and aligned by orbital correction pulses. Not one strike cannon, Not even many, but a lens. Assembled in layers across orbit, refining one focused rail through 47 synchronized satellites. When fired, it wouldn't explode. It would resolve. Not against armor or hull, but against subspace geometry. The Vordal blade, for all its raw strength, relied on quantum stabilization. Its compression cannons, its internal command net, even the lattice that protected Judgeline, all of it thrived within predictable vacuum constants. Mirrorgate was engineered to shatter that predictability. Not a weapon of mass or energy, but a rupture in certainty. When the blade passed into the simulated threat zone in Valis, it entered a synthetic storm of false signals. Acheron looped threat vectors and entropy shadows until Judgeline initiated recursive evaluation. The AI had been programmed never to hesitate, but also never to waste energy on undefined threats. When those conditions conflicted, it stalled just long enough for the signal from Titan to align. The rail particle didn't move fast. It moved precisely. It arrived exactly where the Vordal blade's auxiliary pressure lattice would be exposed. An aperture less than 2 meters wide, used to vent subatomic waste from its spin drive chambers. At the instant of alignment, Mirrorgate fired. No flash, no recoil, no explosion. To the naked eye, the blade simply shrank, as if its center collapsed inward, sucked into an invisible core that didn't exist a moment before. The metal twisted like cloth caught in water, its frame folding, not in space, but away from it. One moment, the galaxy's most dangerous ship existed. The next, it didn't. Across 3 sectors, Council AI command modules registered catastrophic anomaly codes. Patrol ships monitoring the region lost sync with their own targeting relays. Ghost signatures, once considered a nuisance, were now treated as potential catastrophic events. A classified feed from a DeLorean scout craft captured the entire sequence, and its pilot, trained in threat response since childhood, simply muttered. It blinked. No Terran fleet appeared. No fleet needed to. What Earth had deployed wasn't just a strike, it was a statement in the language of physics. The Council's most unbreakable logic. Its reliance on force, tech, and precision had been inverted. Their greatest asset had been deleted by a system so distributed, so deeply buried, that even its activation signature didn't trace back to Earth. Mirrorgate had never been about scale. It was about presence. Acheron fed the Council illusions, and in the gaps between those illusions, the lens charged. One particle, one alignment, one moment. That was all it took to tell the galaxy that the old rules no longer applied. No video surfaced of the blade's destruction, no leak, no commentary, just a ripple through the command web, 100 reports of frozen AI directives, cascading emergency protocols, and a void where a fleet killer had once existed. In the Council's high chamber, no one spoke for an hour. The High Marshal of the Kerwood Reach, responsible for the blade's deployment, shut down his comm feed and was not seen again. Emergency contingency plans were requested, but half the systems tasked with implementing them now flagged Acheron as a dominant operational variable. They couldn't move without accounting for a force they couldn't trace. And Earth still said nothing. No gloating, no message. Just the removal of a symbol. On Europa, Vex watched the last ghost signature from Valis fade from the archive grid. His fingers hovered over the console, motionless. Not from doubt, not from triumph, but from sheer calm. The mission had never been to destroy the blade. It had been to show that even a blade forged by gods could disappear like myth. He stood, finally, and walked to the observatory chamber. Titan was visible on the live feed, just a silent orb wrapped in stormy orange and soft shadows. No one looking at it would think it had housed the most precise kill mechanism in human history. No one would suspect. That was the point. Let them guess. Let them overcorrect. Let them whisper. The Vordal blade was gone, and in its place, the galaxy found something far more dangerous. An answer that couldn't be spoken, only felt. It's a reminder that Earth didn't need to win battles. It only needed to erase the idea that the Council could win at all. In the aftermath of the Blade's disappearance, silence became doctrine. Across dozens of sectors, Council fleets paused mid-route. Orders to strike or to regroup went unanswered. Relay nodes returned only static. Automated deployment schedules were halted, frozen behind access restrictions that no longer matched existing protocols. Some ships remained adrift for hours. No guidance, no confirmation, only the echo of systems that once trusted the future to be predictable. The illusion of control had always run on continuity. Now that continuity had been broken by something the Council could neither categorize nor retaliate against, many commanders did the only thing that made sense. They shut down. Entire wings of the enforcement fleet rerouted to dead space under the guise of system recalibration. Others, disillusioned and unsupervised, simply turned off their transponders and vanished into the black, abandoning Council sigils in favor of silence. A few transmitted farewell messages to their species, short, cryptic notes that never named Earth, but implied a loss deeper than territory. The Council tried to reassert command. They issued decrees, summoned allies, promised recalibration, but no one was listening. On the world of Elithar, a vital relay hub, the civilian government voted to revoke its Council charter, not to join Earth, not to declare rebellion, just to be done. Other neutral systems followed. What began as political friction crystallized into a cascading movement. Small, sovereign pockets, disconnecting from a structure that had once promised order, but now offered only exposure. Even trade routes mutated. Council-certified supply chains collapsed as fuel depots and convoy managers refused to honor legacy codes. No boycott was declared. It was simpler than that. People stopped trusting the routes that once defined their lives. And where structure failed, necessity stepped in. Humanity, paradoxically, didn't push forward. It didn't offer new treaties, new alliances, or even a seat at some imagined table of power. Earth remained quiet. The few messages that passed from Terran space into the wider systems weren't proclamations, they were logistics. Medical exchange proposals, resource swaps, secure comms rentals. Earth didn't come to rule, it came to function. And in that void, a new alignment emerged. The colonies, once scattered across sanctioned coordinates and license-locked settlements, began to self-organize under what would be called the Acheron Accord, a decentralized framework built not on centralized rule, but interoperable autonomy. Each colony governed itself, coordinated through Acheron nodes that handled shared infrastructure. No single leader, no throne, just structure built on mutual necessity, information integrity, and a quiet refusal to ever again rely on systems that required permission to survive. Council observers labeled it disjointed, unsustainable, incoherent. Then their own nodes began requesting access. By the third month post-Blade, over 40 independent systems had routed trade requests through Acheron conduits. Not because they agreed with Earth's ideology, Earth had offered none, but because the lines worked. Cargo arrived on time, payment was encrypted and verified, disputes were mediated through neutral AI moderators, trained not in allegiance but in clarity. Earth wasn't forgiven. No one wrote that headline. The Council didn't fall in a dramatic collapse, nor did its remaining members beg for peace. What happened instead was far stranger. Earth became unmanageable, uncontrollable, too complex to box, too fluid to engage, too interconnected to threaten. It didn't break the galaxy's systems, it made them obsolete. And Vex, the architect behind it all, disappeared from the strategic grid. No fanfare, No monuments, just a message logged in the Europa node network 2 weeks after the last council motion failed to pass. Final control relinquished, mesh autonomy achieved, reassignment requested. He returned not to Earth, but to the Europa intelligence sanctum, where Acheron had first learned how to lie in the service of truth. There, he took a position not in command, but in review. His new title, Director of Ethical Systems Oversight in Autonomous Conflict Modeling. His new mission, to ensure no one, human or otherwise, built another Mirrorgate without understanding the cost. He refused interviews, declined awards. When asked by a former colleague what victory felt like, he responded with a simple data packet. An unmarked video loop of the Titan sky, filmed during Mirrorgate's final alignment. It contained no audio, just the silent, icy horizon. The only public record of Vex's final analysis was submitted as a post-operational debrief log. One line, carved into the archival vault. We didn't win by fighting harder. We made fighting itself obsolete. That quote would be copied onto monuments across fringe colonies, not as a boast, but as a warning. And long after, in the halls of diminished power and abandoned war rooms, the Council's remaining strategists would speak of Earth in hushed tones, not for what it built, but for what it refused to build again. No empire, no claim, no supremacy. Just a network of people who, when pressed into rebellion, chose instead to rewrite what rebellion meant. And somewhere, in dusty comlogs, one final line endured. Never declare humans as rebels. Rebels can be crushed. But humans? Humans rewrite the map. What did you think? Was Earth justified in dismantling the Council's grip without ever firing a fleet-wide shot? Did humanity cross a line with Mirrorgate? Or did they show the galaxy that sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon of all? Comment below. Would you trust a system like Acheron? Or would you fear it more than any dreadnought? Hit that subscribe button for more thrilling HFY stories.